Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Good morning. It's a time of year for home, obviously, but for millions of us it's also a time when we travel, almost instinctively, back to some place that is special for us, some suburb or fold in the rural landscape or distant view of the ocean that is forever dug into our imaginations. At special times of the year, we turn to family and friends, of course, but also to landscapes. And this morning we're going to be talking about that sense of place, about rootedness, magical places and wandering. I'm joined by two writers, a landscape painter and a singer, though Ian Bostridge is also a writer, author of a wonderful new book about Schubert's song cycle, Winterreise. Philip Marsden's book, Rising Ground, A Search for the Sense of Place, is also a love letter to the West Country, and in particular, somewhere we don't talk enough about on this programme or any other, Cornwall. Joanne Parker's Britannia Obscura is a book of alternative maps of Britain. We all carry our private, hidden maps inside our heads, I think. The maps are the places that mean most to us, but hers ranges from caves and canals to ley lines. Finally, Victoria Crowe is a gorgeously talented painter who has dug herself into the landscape of the Scottish borders. Song, oil paint, history and tramping. Not a bad start to this particular week. Joanne, can I start with you? Your book looks at all sorts of alternative maps of Britain, but before we get on to the individual ones, do you believe that we have different shaped Britons inside all of our heads?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's really important that we're not defined by anybody else's map of Britain. On one level, we all have our own individual map. Mine probably has a small Devon village at the centre of it, South Seal.
Good for you, yep.
York is important, Edinburgh's important, and then it probably kind of peters out somewhere around Torridon in Scotland, because I've never been north of there.
And so we get straight away to the difference between place and space. A place is somewhere with its own grip on our imagination, and space is all the kind of wildernesses between that, yes?
Yeah, and one person's place is very much another person's space, I think. We all have our own personal maps of Britain, but they're also kind of communal maps as well that certain communities share. Because I think landscape it's probably first and foremost the way of creating belongingness and tying us together.
And in your book, Britannia Obscura, you try to find obscure kinds of maps of Britain, not just very old ones, but things like the Caver's map of Britain, which is an entirely different way of seeing the country, because this country is mined all over the place by extraordinary and very large cave systems, which if you're a caver or a potholer, you know about, but the rest of us don't.
I deliberately went out really to try to see the country through other people's eyes. And in that sense, it's in a way, it's not my book. There's sort of 5 different visions of Britain, none of which is personally mine. Although in writing, I discovered that I'd written more about Cornwall and Devon, more about the northeast. And so accidentally, in a way, my footprints are all over it.
But I think this is going to be a West Country-y kind of show, and we'll come on to that again in later. But you also, for instance, looked at the map of Britain seen through the canal builders' eyes, which is very interesting because that was a transportation system which in many ways mimics a lot of the current road system, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, the motorways are built very much on the bones of the old canal system, as are the railways. For canal enthusiasts, of course, it was very sad that an awful lot of them got filled in and are literally right underneath motorways and the sort of rail lines that we have today.
So now let's come on to the most controversial part of your book, which is ley lines. These direct lines across the landscape, supposedly referring to some kind of spiritual force or possibly just the quickest way of getting from A to B. Just tell us a little bit about the history of ley lines to start with.
Oh, well, it started in the 1920s with Alfred Watkins, and for him, they were prehistoric pathways, the sort of easiest way for ancient man to find his way across the landscape.
You'd take two kind of tors or lumps in the landscape and just draw a straight line between them. Yes. Sight lines, in a sense.
Yeah, and it began with natural features, particularly interesting hills, or he even sort of thought about clumps of trees, although obviously that doesn't really work because
they've all gone.
And then his idea was that prehistoric man would then create other artificial man-made sites that could also be used as way markers, I suppose. So things like stone circles, stone rows.
So they start as a very down-to-earth idea, straightforwardly ancient highways along which ancient mankind moved around the island.
They do, although they're a little bit too down to earth in a way. A lot of people since then have noted that to follow those pathways, you would be walking through very deep bogs and getting stuck in marshes, and they sort of said, well, no, nobody would ever do that.
And then 60s, 70s, they all go a bit new age, to say the least.
Yeah, then they got reinterpreted as energy lines, some sort of magnetic force maybe. Nobody was ever quite agreed on what exactly it constituted, some sort of earth energy.
And this guy, Michel, very important in the story.
Yeah, that was John Michel in the 60s, and he really kind of reinvented the idea of ley lines and popularised them as energy lines.
Sort of spiritual energy coursing through the landscape.
Yeah, and his idea was that sites like stone circles, again, stone rows, were built along those lines by peoples who were kind of sensitive, I suppose, to the energy in a way that we'd forgotten.
We have a real sense, don't we, Philip Marsden, that we want to believe there are hidden meanings in landscapes. But in your book, you make it quite clear that often the case it's just a strange piece of rock outcrop. I'm thinking of Tintagel or something like that. Actually, there is no underlying spiritual or other meaning than the sheer coincidence of geology.
I think that's what's most interesting about landscape in a way, is that it's a blank canvas on which one can put all sorts of meanings, and through different periods there have been this tradition of different meanings. Interesting what Joanne's saying about Alfred Watkins's original interpretation of ley lines, and archaeologists now are looking at a lot of Neolithic sites in terms of sight lines, so that you have a very prominent natural feature, and then almost to sort of reference it or to sacralise it, you have stone rows, stone circles, barrows, which reference natural features in a straight line.
So we don't need to have any sort of sense of a throbbing energy coursing underneath the Earth's crust.
Well, no, as you said, that interpretation of the ley lines came later. Whether it's true or not, well, that's up to one's own interpretation. But I think what can be said is looking at a map, say, of Bodmin Moor, I've examined these maps of different Neolithic sites, all aligning almost like a flight path on one particular hill. A very large proportion of them focus on one particular hill. So you have these sight lines, which are equivalent in a way to Alfred Watkins's ley lines.
And so it's not impossible, is it, Joanne, that what starts off as a practical thing that people course around the landscape and then find their way around becomes accrued with some kind of cultural and then possibly spiritual meaning as well.
No, and it's also possible that it was always aesthetic, that it was always to do with just sort of appreciating the landscape, because there's no reason to think that people thousands of years ago appreciated it aesthetically any less than we do ourselves. So it may just have been a kind of lining up of significant sites to make things look nice. I'm
very interested in this idea of what makes a site significant. And in Philip's book, there are two interesting West Country examples in particular that I homed in on. One is Tintagel, which is a castle which looks extraordinarily kind of romantic and Arthurian and so forth, but it's really a cod castle in many ways. We'll come on to that. And the other is Glastonbury. Let's talk about Tintagel first of all. Again, a good example of something that has kind of spiritual and certainly narrative historical meaning, almost by accident.
Well, not in a sense by accident. I think the whole thing comes from its physical shape, actually. Yeah. And we can go there now, and there is what's called the island attached to the mainland with this very, very narrow isthmus. And a lot of the mythology about Tintagel, the contemporary mythology, comes from Geoffrey of Monmouth's reference to it, and the idea that it was a redoubt for Arthur's mother, King Arthur's mother, to sort of to hole up, and no one could get there, no one could cross this bridge, and telling the story of Arthur's conception in that way. So you have a physical shape of land,
the coincidence, as it were.
Yes, and then it gives rise to a story which is attached to it, and then of course, because it's Arthurian, it has all sorts of power behind it. And 800 years later, we're still, you can park your car in King Arthur's car park.
So we move from geology to geography to cod history to some kind of real history, and then a kind of stickiness of spiritual meanings that are stuck on much later.
Yes, I mean, I don't think it is cod history. I think that interpretation, that response...
Geoffrey of Monmouth is a terrible liar.
But he provided the sort of narrative basis, if you like, for Tintagel, and it has appeal because of that.
Now, both of you, Joanne and Philip, have been making these journeys around the country, and very often what appears to be a chapter or a piece of writing about landscape becomes a piece of writing about individual people, either ancient antiquarians, or there's an amazing guy in your book, Philip, who thinks he can hear the beating heart of Cornwall, which is a problem because he's also a kind of conventionally religious man as well.
There's a wonderful group of the pagans of West Penwith who I spent some time with, and someone told me the story about going up to Cambrai, which is one of the most visible and also ancient sites in Cornwall, and his grandfather took him up as a boy. He thrust his hand into the soil of Cambrai, and he said, that's the beating heart of Cornwall, but don't go telling your grandmother because she thinks I'm a good Methodist.
You also come up against a lot of New Age people in your book, Joanne. Is it too unfair to ask what your verdict was on these sort of gentle giants of modern England, the Druid movement and so forth?
They look after an awful lot of monuments. It's good, I think, to have a community that's interested in preserving them. I mean, an awful lot of them are neglected on the sides of motorways. They get things built through the middle of them. They get vandalised. And if nothing else, it's a community that has a sense of ownership for those monuments and it really does look after them.
Philip, I'd like to come on to Cornwall in a little bit more detail, as it were, because in your book you talk about Lyonesse, which is the sunken and possible kingdom to the west of Cornwall, again reimagined by Tennyson in particular. But to what extent do you think the Cornish difference is about language, and how much is it about the sheer granitic structure, the shape of that part of England?
It's a big and knotty problem. I like to think that it's actually to do with the physical entity of Cornwall. And it's interesting, both the Cornish for Cornwall, Cerno, and Cornwall itself has the same word, corn, kern, which means horn. So the shape of the land is in the name of it. The horn
of England sticking out into the sea.
Thrust out, as Jaquetta Hawke says, thrust out into the ocean.
And the Cornish people, like the Welsh, are still speaking a remnant of ancient Britannic speech. And, of course, that's also the case, Victoria Crowe, with your part of the country, with southern Scotland, because that was anciently what we would now call a Welsh kingdom. The Gododin were based around Edinburgh and then moved south before they were slaughtered by the wretched Northumbrians. Do you have a strong sense of the historical stories of the part of Scotland that you've settled in?
Well, I think being in the borders, one does become used to thinking about how the land has been shaped by generations beforehand. And as Philip was saying about Cornwall, I think it's this idea of remoteness that's important, because I have Cornish relations, we can go back to 1620, but they only moved within a tiny bit of Penwith. I mean, they just didn't move for over 400 years. And I think probably the remote areas of Scotland would be similar, so that you would get people like Jenny Armstrong, that we ended up living next door to, who was born 2 miles away in the Pentlands and stayed there all her working life.
I want to come on to Jenny Armstrong in a minute, but I'm very interested, if you look at the maps in the other two books of ancient monuments, they're all kind of pushed towards the west and north of the islands. And the east and south, including the Scottish borders, have far fewer of them. And I wondered to what extent the landscape that you're in is one that's scoured by the English-Scottish wars again and again and again. I'm aware that part of the country has surprisingly few villages because so many were burned down, and that even now, hundreds of years later, you are still living and working in a kind of post-war landscape.
Yes, and I think the border on that side of Scotland moved up and down hugely, didn't it? And then there were rival factions within the borderlands as well, of course. And I think also because of the farming and mineral deposits around where we were, that's changed quite a lot as well. There's been lead and silver and silicon sand quarries. So that as well has changed the landscape right the way through to Dumfries House in the west.
Now, we've talked about ley lines briefly and the geology and so forth. As a painter, what is it about a landscape that gets underneath your skin? Is it literally the fold and shape of the skyline, the chance collection of trees perhaps and so forth? What is it that makes you excited about one landscape rather than another, place rather than space?
I think it's the relationship of person to the place. I have to know a landscape really well before I can paint it. I can't just sort of turn up and think, oh yes, that's a nice view, I'll sit down and work with that. And for instance, Kitley Now was very much a discovery of what the landscape was about through the people that we met there. I mean, physically it was 1,000 feet up. We had the Pentland Hills to the west, we had the Moorfoots in the far distance, incredible winters, months of snow in the 70s, which transformed the landscape into a sort of magical place anyway, because you didn't get the normal reference to the landscape. It was reversed, tonalities were reversed. But I think what really made a difference to me as a erstwhile towny kind of person was learning about the countryside through observing the shepherd, Jenny Armstrong.
So let's talk about Jenny. She never moved from that area, and she was somebody you came to know, and you don't normally put figures into your landscapes, but Jenny suddenly started popping up all over the place.
That's right, and in the very first one, the large tree group, which I suppose is the most dramatic of some of those winter landscapes, she's just a tiny cipher, and she was really there just to give scale. to the
on
land.
the edge of the picture, yes.
That's right. But then she became more and more dominant, because it was through her that I learnt how to interpret the landscape. Because, I mean, I would look and see a dry stone dyke or a scar from old quarrying, and to me they were just punctuations on a painted landscape. But to her they were where she would maybe find a ewe sheltering and giving birth to a lamb, or where, when the wind was in a certain direction, she would know which side of the dry stone dyke to find the sheep. So there was this other level of knowledge which was from experience. It couldn't be learnt.
And this takes us very much back to Philip's book, because this is really what we're talking about. The landscape, not just simply as a space we move through, but as a place that has a human history that means something to us and was worked and lived in and suffered through, and that's what gives it meaning.
There's the Cornish painter Peter Lanyon had this particular battle.
We want to talk about Peter Lanyon, definitely.
And this sort of battle with his own peers of the St Ives school in the sort of middle of the 20th century. He was the only one who was Cornish. And his paintings reference particular places, and he used to go up if he saw someone painting on a cliff. He would go up and say, "You do realise that there are miners working on this cliff." So he had this sense of belonging, but was also part of the abstract expressionist movement.
And they were mostly abstract painters who went down there, or artists, Barbara Hepworth and people like that, and Ben Nicholson.
Very much, and they were sort of converting, if you like, the particular of the West Penwith moors into ideas, whereas to Lanyon they were places. They were places that his family knew, that he knew, and that he experienced, and so he articulates it very well.
Struggling with the edge between landscape painting and abstract painting is a famously kind of 20th century problem, and I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about it, Victoria Crowe. I'm thinking also of Anne Redpath, the Scottish painter who was painting on the East Coast. Again, almost abstract paintings, but there's clearly still colours and shapes and some kind of horizon line which derives from naturalistic painting.
Yes, I think that goes back a bit to what I was saying about the snow transforming the landscape. And some of the recent paintings I've been doing have been about twilight landscapes as well. So it's kind of getting away from the idea that a painting about landscape is somehow a simulacrum for the real thing. It's not that at all. It's become transformed into object, if you like.
Something in its own right. Something different. Right. And you've talked very usefully about snow and a twilight, which allows me to talk to Ian Bostridge in a second, because Winterreise is the ultimate snowy twilight journey through the endless German forests and Wald. And I wonder, Ian, first of all, whether you think Winterreise is a journey that could not have been made in Britain, because in Britain you always come up against another border, another place, the sea or a hill or something. In Germany you have this sense of endlessness, which is quite important to the spiritual meaning of Winterreise.
I think so. There's also, I think what's very important in the piece is the contrast between the town he leaves, the village that he comes across in his journey, and the abstractness of the snowy landscape. I think it's actually not a specific place. It is space in a way. It's
he's
abstract.
Moving through. At one point in the book, you say that it's a parallel to the journey of life. You're moving through a cold and desolate journey.
Confronting yourself, because it's empty and it's essentially featureless, I think.
Now, one thing, I can't unfortunately show Victoria's paintings on the radio, but we can hear the first of the wonderful songs that you sing in Winterreise cycle, just to give us a sense of that. We're going to hear a bit now.
Fremd bin ich eingezogen, fremd zieh ich wieder aus. Bemai war mir gewogen mit manchem Blumenstrauß. Das Mädchen sprach von Liebe, die Mutter gar von ihm. Das Mädchen sprach von Liebe, die Mutter gar von ihm. Nun ist die Welt so trübe, der Weg gehüllt in Schnee. Nun ist die Welt so trübe, der Weg gehüllt in Schnee.
Ian, you think that Winterreise should be part of our internal cultural landscape just as much as some of the works of Shakespeare or perhaps The Messiah at that level?
I think it has it comes out of a very specific historical period, but it's a historical period that has is the beginning of our time, the period in which it's beginning to be discovered that actually the Earth exists in deep time, and people begin to be worried about the fact that they don't live in a world that's 4,000 years old. They live in a world that's millions of years old. They no longer feel connected to it. They realise that the landscape that they live in is not a permanent feature. It's changed enormously. Nationalism is at issue, and also marketisation, not feeling at home because of the impingement of the market, which is something Schubert lived in. He's the first of the great canonical composers to have operated solely within the marketplace.
And these are gorgeous, kind of sweet, but also quite cold, existential songs. They are about the human journey, and they're kind of existential. They're Beckettian, almost.
They're Beckettian, and they were very much an influence on Beckett. I mean, I've performed a piece in the Enniskillen Beckett Festival to an audience mainly of theatre-goers without actually the text in front of them, which I thought would be annoying, but actually it had an immediate theatrical appeal as a Beckettian landscape.
And yet, Ian, when you bring Winterreise to a British audience, you are bringing something that is very important to British history too, because our cultures have been so interlinked. And in this case, it's a period when Germany has been oppressed, is still being oppressed by the French, first of all,
yes,
and then by the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the reaction.
And also in the 19th century, the enormous influence of German culture on British culture, on British poetic culture, and on British musical culture, which is obviously less important because there wasn't much great British music being written. But, you know, all the writers, I mean, you think of George Eliot was immersed in German literature. And that's something we really no longer have because of the intervention of the things that happened in the 20th century. We're rather cut off from German culture, I think.
And yet, this time of year, we all go back to Handel, and a lot of people go back to Haydn.
It's and Christmas trees.
And Christmas trees and so forth. If there is one part of the year which could make us reconsider our relationship with Germany, it's this time of year. Sorry, I think, Philip, you wanted to come in.
No, I just want to return to what you said about this moment when the awareness of sort of deep time, as you put it, and so there was a sort of huge loneliness that comes out of the piece. And yet there's also these sort of magical elements in it, like the will-o'-the-wisp, and the mock suns. And I wonder whether, in a sense, that was a sort of reaction against this alarming sense of
I think the will-o'-the-wisp, and particularly the mock suns, it's a very traditional romantic trope. I mean, a lot of the romantic poets in Britain were writing about atmospheric light phenomena because they saw them as being on the cusp between the fantastical and the supernatural and the physical. People were trying to come up with physical explanations of them, but couldn't. I mean, things like the spectre of the Brocken, which Coleridge visited 2 or 3 times, which is this basically a shadow projected in an enormous way on water vapour.
Ian, can you tell us a little bit about Schubert at this particular time in his life?
He contracted syphilis probably in late 1822, and he suddenly sort of put his skates on in terms of the amount of work he did. He was in hospital, miserable, wrote Die schöne Müllerin, had periods, up and down periods, but produced an enormous amount of work in those last 5 years. He died in 1828, and he found this cycle of poems, the first bit of them, in 1827. And I do think, I mean, we're all very wary of biographical criticism, but I think it's crucial that his experiences are fed into his work as an artist. I'm interested, Victoria, whether you feel that your personal experiences, your life as a person, feed into your work, or whether those are two separate things.
No, it's the work is a subtext for my life, for my experiences, and I think particularly the paintings in Scotland were really it is like a soul's journey. I think you've all made points about how place and importance of place can be reflected in this whole idea of us seeking meaning. And I think also there's a kind of Jungian concept to all of this as well, whereby we are acknowledging myth and the unconscious. And I think it was something that you said, Philip, earlier on, where maybe things are arranged in a landscape in a certain way that make people respond, and it can be people responding from many different generations to the same gathering together of forms and shapes. So I think the personal inner journey is also something that informs all the discussions that we have about landscape.
For me, it was that resonance, the discovery in recent archaeological analysis of Neolithic monuments, that it was about place, it was about natural features in the landscape at a time where we were re-examining our relationship with the landscape. And you could find a resonance 5,000, 6,000 years ago sufficient. I mean, the power of their response was sufficient to sort of move huge rocks. I think it's exactly the same response in a sense that we can feel as individuals looking at particular landscapes.
Ian?
I'm interested that what seems to be happening is a sort of turning on end of this tradition in historical writing of saying that in the early 19th century people suddenly discovered the landscape, and before that people found the landscape a scary place. They didn't appreciate it. They got through what they thought of as barren landscapes as quickly as they could. They were worried about being mugged. They thought it was threatening. They thought it was full of goblins and terrible things. And Schubert is part of that first generation of people who appreciate or maybe the second generation of people who appreciate the landscape as something sublime. I mean, he makes visits to bits of Austria that have amazing mountain landscape and writes a symphony probably inspired by that. But it's interesting I think it makes much more sense to realise that people in Neolithic times probably had an aesthetic response as well.
Yes, I mean, Joanne's title references William Camden's Britannia 200 or 300 years before that, when actually there was a great popularity, it seems, to discover the physical nature of the land and just simply to know what it looked like. And John Leyland, whose work Camden used, was the first to sort of go out and simply write about rivers and hills and what was there. And that seemed to me a huge sort of leap, if you like, from the abstract and sort of medieval idea of place and space into the physical world. And it was John Leyland and later William Camden that did that.
Yeah.
But also,
sorry, I was about to say what I really love about Camden as well is that he mixes up natural features with sort of folklore and family histories, and it's sort of the people are inseparable from the landscape as well.
And let's bring this down a little bit more specifically, because Leland visited Glastonbury, one of the key sites there, and one of the interesting things about the effect of history on landscape in your book is the huge changes in Glastonbury, which goes from being an absolutely important, the navel of Britishness in some respects, the navel of Englishness, spiritually and in terms of the church, to being somewhere that is devastated by the Reformation and Cromwell, and then we now know Glastonbury in a completely different light. Just tell us a little bit about what happened to Glastonbury just at the cusp of the Reformation.
There's a wonderful moment in the sort of history of topography when John Leyland, the father of topography, stands on the threshold. He arrives at the great library of Glastonbury in 1533, the year that
massive cathedral there, massive abbey, I should say, and huge library, lots and lots of religious relics.
The body of Arthur, the teeth of the apostles. I mean, the list of pilgrimage bait there was phenomenal. It was a sort of key place, and he arrived there and saw the library, and it sent him on a 12-year odyssey to discover not only the libraries as they vanished, but also the land around him, just as it was disappearing. Just as all
thanks to his patron, Henry VIII.
Yes, exactly. Didn't compromise his own patriotism, but he saw it. He wanted to sort of recreate the physical nature of the land in his own work.
The sheer violence of that time continues to surprise us. I think there was a lovely abbot of Glastonbury who ends up hewn in different pieces and stuck on pikes.
Richard Whiting, exactly. He was the very same abbot that showed John Leyland the library, and just a few years later, exactly, he was on top of the
tower. And the Holy Thorn itself.
Yes, 100 years later, Cromwell's army came and sort of hacked down the Christmas flowering thorn, because in the same way it was seen as a sort of physical worship, almost idolatrous. And there's always been this interesting conflict between the sort of established religious notion of universalism and particular local cults. And Glastonbury and the thorn, for instance, represented the local.
So that also takes us to the other tree that we certainly want to talk about, the Lindenbaum, the linden tree. Probably the best known, I suppose, of all of these. Maybe the Hurdy-Gurdy Man's better known. I don't know these songs.
Certainly in German culture, the Lindenbaum has become a folk song, and it was rewritten in the 19th century by a man called Zilcher, and it's been sung on numerous sort of camping expeditions, and with people not even knowing who it was by. I think the tree is important. It is a sort of mystical tree, and it's a song about memory.
It's where German villagers would go to gather round way back in time. And
they'd dance around it. They'd have the thing around it, which was the sort of political gathering. It's in a way, it's a symbol of German identity, but it's also a symbol of memory. I mean, I don't think it's insignificant that when Proust writes that famous bit about dipping the Madeleine in the tea, it's in lime flower tea.
Lime flower tea, yes. The special smell of the lime trees.
Yes.
Yes. Does it do to German culture what the oak is in English culture?
I think that's probably a good comparison.
But in this song, we should say the linden tree is also a slightly sinister figure, trying to call the traveller back to what would be a very cold and frosty bed.
Yes, I tend to think that's Thomas Mann really laying it on thick and saying it's death, and actually at the end of The Magic Mountain, his great novel, Hans Castorp goes into battle in the trenches singing this song.
It's quite a creepy song. I think we should hear it now.
Okay.
Ich träumt in seinem Schatten so manchen süßen Traum. Ich schnitt in seine Rinde so manches liebe Wort. Es zog in Freud und Leide zu ihm mich immer fort.
Victoria,
I was interested listening to the linden tree, that when Caspar David Friedrich painted some wonderful fir trees, he painted an altarpiece that included a fir tree with a crucifix just hit by the setting sun. And one of the local newspapers at the time said, he's put the damn landscape into the altar. How can he do that? This is too much sort of nature mystic. Whereas I think that aspect of everybody finding a way through the landscape to their own sense of being is important.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned Friedrich, because without Friedrich you can't imagine Schubert. Without Schubert you can't quite imagine Friedrich. They go together like conjoined twins.
I was really pleased to find that there were sort of 3 degrees of separation, in that they had a friend in common, a friend for whom Friedrich bought his military uniform and who Schubert drank with in Vienna. So there is actually a concrete connection. I think it's interesting looking at Victoria's paintings of the shepherd. When you look at them without knowing anything about them, you can't but think of Friedrich, because Friedrich is full of landscape with small figures.
We should explain to those who don't know that Caspar David Friedrich is the great German Romantic painter.
Yeah.
And all of those pictures of chaps in long coats stood against the sunset or in cold, frosty, frozen landscapes, they're all him.
They are, but they are all, most of them are outsiders. They're dressed in urban clothes, they're dressed in whereas, of course, Jenny the shepherd is in a way part of the landscape. So I feel that seems very different to me.
Victoria, you paint extraordinary trees, one of your sort of signature themes. Are you influenced by Friedrich at all? Because he's another of the great tree painters, I suppose.
Yes, I am, because he always, in his paintings, shows you the psychological undercurrent of a landscape. I mean, he talks as well about alienation. He talks about loneliness. He talks about how... And so there's a lot of Christian imagery as well in his work, of course, so that there's like... you get kind of conflicting ideas of anxiety, but also of possible redemption. But I think the thing that I like most about his work is the way in which the real is juxtaposed against the ethereal. So he's all the time talking about the sort of subtext of the here and now, the permanence, the impermanence of life, something that's very ephemeral coming up against something that's very constant.
Because he's also looking very intently at the here and now and producing very, I suppose, almost touchable, smellable paintings.
Yes, and I think a lot of his preparatory work as well were the most incredible observation.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I very much liked about your book, Philip, was when you were talking about how you began to understand a place by that incredible observation. You talk about looking for the roof of your house as you're coming down at the first moment you're going to see it.
Yes, I think something about the discovery of place is the intensity of noticing and the familiar. I mean, I spent a lot of my writing life travelling, and I've sort of come home, if you like, and the discovery of the details of a place and what makes it up and its past has been a revelation for me.
I'm rather aware of all of those people listening saying, hold on a second, but I live in Swindon, or I'm right opposite a large motorway. I don't really have the sense of place that you lucky people are talking about. But Victoria, you obviously clearly were from England, and you were adopted into a landscape. So it's perfectly possible to find your magical landscape, to find your special place, as long as you do the historical work and the proper work of walking and reading and looking and talking.
And thinking. Yes.
I think there's urban landscape as well. I mean, I feel I have this idealised view of wanting to go on holiday to a beautiful landscape, but essentially I'm a Londoner. I've lived in London all my life. And the magical landscapes for me are sort of, places like Streatham, because that's where I grew up. And I think that's something a writer like Ian Sinclair does. He finds the magic in landscapes that to us are not at all romantic, that are very, gritty and urban, but they do have their own layers of...
You don't have to go to the edges. You don't have to go to the Green Isle of the Great Deep.
And in urban landscapes, you have it right there. I mean, in a rural, bare, moorland landscape, there's nothing to look at, and the past is not suggested. Whereas in an urban landscape, you have layers and layers of architecture and community, very much visible and obvious.
And everything we do to the landscape then changes our notions about it. Joanne, in your book, you have an aerial landscape, Britain as seen from the air, with all the flight paths and so on, an entirely different map, unfamiliar to most people.
Yeah, there are lots of hidden landscapes within the sort of Britain that we're familiar with. There's no way any of us ever see those maps normally, that there's sort of flight paths that go across Britain.
I can remember going by helicopter around Britain, and if you're in a helicopter, what really matters is where all the fuel dumps are. So there's an entirely different way of getting around Britain from one refuelling stop to the next. And
they have their own sort of historic centres as well. I mean, so Farnborough Common, for instance, is very important site.
The spiritual origins of flight in Britain is Farnborough Common, and there's a tree there, in fact, talking about linden trees and oak trees, the tree in Farnborough Common. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's allegedly the tree that Samuel Cody tied airplane number 1 to.
Airplane number 1.
I know, I love its name. But before its first flight, successful flight above Britain. So that was the first heavier than air flight.
Army aeroplane number 1. So that's a kind of spiritual source if you're into planes.
Yeah, but it actually died in 1940. But it was so important to aviation enthusiasts and historians that it was filled with resin and mounted in concrete. So it's still there, although sort of as a kind of saintly relic now.
Victoria, when you're painting, do you have a sort of process of going back to what was in front of you originally, the landscape, and coming back to your studio? Is there a danger in spending too much time looking at the landscape and not enough time making the picture, and a parallel danger of not going back often enough to look hard?
Well, I suppose it's a lifetime of practice, really, to get that balance right. So there is a lot of drawing from observation and then working away in the studio. But I'm not really far enough from a lot of the sources. And certainly the 20 years that we lived at Kitley Now, that there was a daily walking around of the landscape, so that one begins to absorb the light, the pattern, the flicker, the whole sense of the place, so that you know every little twist and turn in a path, or every area where there'd be reeds under the snow which make a different colour.
Fantastic, yes.
So it's that kind of, just that close knowledge of being and experiencing, which I seem to be able to carry quite well in my head.
You sound very much like David Hockney talking about Bridlington in East Yorkshire.
What I'm not good at is doing the kind of structure, so I have to look at the structure again. That's why I have to really keep going back to source.
We're coming to the end of what I found a very, very interesting conversation. I'm going to put you all on the spot slightly now. The weather is drawing in, it's getting cold and dark, and I want you to describe for the people listening what your ideal, your perfect landscape is, the special place that you hold inside you. I'm going to come to Philip first, because I'm sure you've got a good answer to that.
It happened to be my current home. I moved there 4 years ago. It's a creekside. It's got the sea in it, but it's tidal. It's got oak woods, and it's got a little sense of the past, suggested by ruined quays and the silting up of the creek,
and a few prehistoric lumps up on the top.
One or two, but at this time of the year, these lovely bare trees just coming right down to the water.
Victoria, I guess again it's going to be home, is it for you?
It's going to be home for me. It's going to be a moorland looking across to the Pentlands with the beech trees, which describe the way the wind blows. They describe the prevailing wind by the very form of them. And it's going to be intensely cold with a sunlight behind, so that you get a sense of not only this physical place, but also the possibilities through looking at the light and through the distance of this continual sort of axis between the real and the suggested.
Ian.
Mine is a sort of fake landscape in that it's urban, but it's Hampstead Heath. We live almost next to Hampstead Heath, and to go there and have the fantasy that you're in a non-London landscape, to feel that you're actually on the edge of London, which of course you aren't, but it feels like that, and to see the seasons and the different effects, it's an incredible place.
Good answer. Joanne.
Oh, I think mine is to go back to a place that I visited in Derbyshire while I was writing the book, which is directly above an enormous underground chasm called Tighton. And because you can stand in this one specific space and you know that there's 10 metres of soil beneath your feet and then just nothing, this huge empty chasm. And to me, it absolutely sums up the sense of how much is hidden in the British landscape. There's so much more than you can see on at first sight.
Marvellous. And mine, if anyone's interested, is a beach in the far northwest of Scotland called Melon Udrugul, which combines the colours of St Lucia and the temperatures of Greenland. Thank you all very much. Ian Bostridge's book is called Schubert's Winter Journey, Anatomy of an Obsession, and Ian's going to be singing Winterreise at the Barbican on the 12th of January. Victoria Crowe's exhibition is called Fleece to Fibre, the Making of the Large Tree Group Tapestry, and that's on the lovely little gallery, the Fleming Collection, in London until February. Joanne Parker's book is called Britannia Obscura, Mapping Hidden Britain, and Philip Marsden's is Rising Ground, A Search for the Spirit of Place, both available in all good bookshops, as we always say. Next week, for 1 week only, Melvyn Bragg, he will be looking back at the writing of Magna Carta 800 years ago. Start to the week, he's back on the 12th of January. But for now, we leave you with Ian Bostridge. And Ian, what are we going to hear?
We're going to hear the last song of Winterreise, which is the barest, most extraordinary song of the whole cycle, the most modern and Beckettian, as we said. The lion man, he's playing a hurdy-gurdy, and the traveller comes across him and says, will you play music to my songs?
And he's a grim, frozen, poor old soul.
Poor old soul, and maybe partly Schubert's vision of himself as he might become.
Let's hear it.
Drüben hinterm Dorfe steht ein Leiermann. Und mit starren Fingern dreht was kann. Barfuß auf dem Eise wankt hin und her. Und sein kleiner Teller bleibt ihm immer leer. Und sein kleiner Teller bleibt ihm immer leer.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Good morning. It's a time of year for home, obviously, but for millions of us it's also a time when we travel, almost instinctively, back to some place that is special for us, some suburb or fold in the rural landscape or distant view of the ocean that is forever dug into our imaginations. At special times of the year we turn to family and friends, of course, but also to landscapes. And this morning we're going to be talking about that sense of place, about rootedness, magical places and wandering. I'm joined by two writers, a landscape painter and a singer, though Ian Bostridge is also a writer, author of a wonderful new book about Schubert's song cycle, Winterreise. Philip Marsden's book,
Railways, for canal enthusiasts, of course, it was very sad that an awful lot of them got filled in and are literally right underneath motorways and the sort of rail lines that we have today.
So now let's come on to the most controversial part of your book, which is ley lines. These direct lines across the landscape, supposedly referring to some kind of spiritual force or possibly just the quickest way of getting from A to B. Just tell us a little bit about the history of ley lines to start with.
Oh, well, it started in the 1920s with Alfred Watkins, and for him, they were prehistoric pathways, the sort of easiest way for ancient man to find his way across the landscape.
You'd take two kind of tors or lumps in the landscape and just draw a straight line between them.
Yes.
Sight lines, in a sense.
Yeah, and it began with natural features, particularly interesting hills, or he even sort of thought about clumps of trees, although obviously that doesn't find by anybody else's map of Britain. On one level, we all have our own individual map. Mine probably has a small Devon village at the centre of it, South Seal.
Good for you, yeah.
York is important, Edinburgh's important, and then it probably kind of peters out somewhere around Torridon in Scotland, because I've never been north of there.
And so we get straight away to the difference between place and space. A place is somewhere with its own grip on our imagination, and space is all the kind of wildernesses between that, yes?
Yeah, and one
By and
person's
large.
place is very much another person's space, I think. We all have our own personal maps of Britain, but there are also kind of communal maps as well that certain communities share. Because I think landscape it's probably first and foremost the way of creating belongingness and tying us together.
And in your book, Britannia Obscura, you try to find obscure kinds of maps of Britain, not just very old ones, but things like the Caver's map of Britain, which is an entirely different way of seeing the country, because this country is mined all over the place by extraordinary and very large cave systems, which if you're a caver or a potholer, you know about, but the rest of us don't.
I deliberately went out really to try to see the country through other people's eyes. And in that sense, it's in a way, it's not my book. There's sort of 5 different visions of Britain, none of which is personally mine. Although in writing, I discovered that I'd written more about Cornwall and Devon, more about the northeast. And so accidentally, in a way, my footprints are all over it. But
I think this is going to be a West Country-y kind of show, and we'll come on to that again in later. But you also, for instance, looked at the map of Britain seen through the canal builders' eyes, which is very interesting because that was a transportation system which in many ways mimics a lot of the current road system, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah, I mean, the motorways are built very much on the bones of the old canal system, as are the...
In ground, a search for the sense of place is also a love letter to the West Country, and in particular, somewhere we don't talk enough about on this programme or any other, Cornwall. Joanne Parker's Britannia Obscura is a book of alternative maps of Britain. We all carry our private hidden maps inside our heads, I think. The maps are the places that mean most to us, but hers ranges from caves and canals to ley lines. Finally, Victoria Crowe is a gorgeously talented painter who has dug herself into the landscape of the Scottish borders. Song, oil paint, history and tramping. Not a bad start to this particular week. Joanne, can I start with you? Your book looks at all sorts of alternative maps of Britain, but before we get on to the individual ones, do you believe that we have different shaped Britons inside all of our heads?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's really important that we're not defined